Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Shiva Asar, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 17. We're done with the complex laws of windows and skylights, but we're still dealing with oyel, the idea of tumas spreading under a certain covering. Today we're going to be primarily dealing with what's called a ziz in Hebrew, which means a ledge sticking out of a door, sticking out of a structure, and how it will spread tumah to everything under that ledge. At the end of the chapter, we'll get some unique laws related to an ancient clay barrel, how the barrels can spread tumah to things under them or inside them. But primarily, we're dealing with the first word of the chapter, ziz. Ziz means a ledge. Specifically, it means a ledge in the Rambam's interpretation where the edge is facing downward. We had in a previous chapter a second type of ledge where the edge goes upwards. It's called a gezura or a gezuzdira. But ziz, the Rambam interprets always as a downward-facing ledge. And we're going to deal with the special laws that apply to ledges in terms of spreading tumah. Says the Rambam halacha aleph, ziz shehu yetze mi pesach habayis. You have a ledge protruding from the entrance of a home. As the commentators explain it, literally coming out of the door. Other interpretations of the Mishnah talk about the ziz coming out of the top of the doorway. But in the Rambam's interpretation, it's from the door itself. Upanav lemata, like any ziz, it has an edge facing downwards. And its height from the ground was 12 handbreadths or less. It will spread tumah under it, even at the slightest size. Typically, you have to have a tefach by a tefach to serve as a proper oil to spread tumah under it. This is one of the exceptions. A ziz coming out of a door, even the slightest amount, will spread tumah to everything under it, which will soon explain to mean that basically if there's a corpse under it and other utensils, the utensils will become impure. The davar barurhu, it's a clear thing, says the Rambam, she'enei mevi ela midivreim, and this is clearly only a rabbinic injunction, this impurity. V'chein kol kayetze b'havas tumah kazu. Same thing as in any similar scenario where we're going to say anything like this, where it spreads tumah, she'ena b'oyel tefach habari, where it's not an oil that's a tefach by a tefach, and it's also not sturdy, because that was also a condition in chapter 13, has to be a sturdy oil. Anytime you see what seems to be a non-sturdy, too small of an oil, and we're still saying that it spreads the tumah, eina ela midivreim, it has to be a rabbinic injunction. Haya gavaya, yeser mishne masar tefach, what if it was higher above on the door, higher than 12 tvachim, oisha hayupanav lemaila, or it was the other type of ledge, with the upwards facing edge. It was facing upwards. Also different decorations and ornaments, archways on top of the structure of a building, and they protrude outward. These are not subject to this special law. They are accessories to the building. They're not part of the building. They're additions. They're a regular oyel. They only spread tumah if they are a tefach by a tefach wide in their protrusion. So to ziz she'al gabe hapesach hayotze min hamashkoif. If the ledge is on top of the doorway, coming out of the lintel, so coming out of here, if there were to be a ledge, even if it wasn't a ledge, it was just a reed that was next to the lintel, coming outwards against the width of the doorway. It will only spread tumah under it if it has a tefach width. Just 2 points here. The case of the ziz, hayetze min hamashkaif, the classic interpretation is that the reason that it requires a full tefach is because it's simply higher than 12 tvachim. Your typical doorway was higher than 12 handbreadths. Although there are those that say that it doesn't matter. There's a special law for a ziz coming out of the top of a doorway that whether it's lower than 12 tvachim or higher than 12 tvachim, it has to be a tefach. The second point is the wording va'afilu. Whenever you say va'afilu, that means there's a novelty in the second law. Not only the ledge, but even if it's a reed, where you would think there's reason to be stringent and allow the tumah to spread even less, it has to still be a tefach. What's the reason you would think to be stringent by a reed? So the source of this law in the Tosefta, all it says is a reed is mitaltel, it's movable. Okay, what about the property of being movable makes it stricter? So we have 3 approaches in the commentaries. One approach is that a reed, since it's not structural material, it was obviously placed over the doorway to be an oyhel, to be a covering. And therefore it should probably serve as a covering even at a lesser size. That's what the Rambam says. Even so, it's a tefach. A second approach is that a reed, unlike a ledge that you attach to the building, becomes kind of part of the building and harder to take out. A reed is very movable, meaning it's easy to take out. Easy to take out might have you think that it's more serving as an oyel, not as part of the building. Same concept. Nevertheless, the Rambam says a tefach. A third approach is an interesting approach, that since it's movable, you might lower it. And once it's lower than 12 tfachim, then it for sure will bring the Tumah even at the slightest size. Therefore, you might think that even when it's on top of the doorway, it can spread Tumah even at a slighter size. Says the Rambam, no, afilu hayakana, it needs to be a Perseach Tefach. Halacha Beis, next halacha, Ziz shehu seviv kol habayis. You have a ledge that surrounds the entirety of the home, v'oichel ba'pesach tefach, and it eats a tefach into the doorway. The classic interpretation of this is that the whole ledge is above the space of the doorway. When we say it eats into the doorway, we mean it eats into the space above the doorway a tefach. Ignore this 3 finger breadth. A tefach. It eats a full tefach into the space above the doorway. That's one interpretation. Others say in the Rambam that it actually means something like this. It's literally eating into the doorway. There was a decorative ledge going around the whole house, and part of it extends into the space of a doorway of a tefach. Says the Rambam, Meis hatuma. This ledge will spread the tuma to under it. That's the first law. In other words, that the entirety of the ledge is considered to be one unit. If there's tuma under one part over here, it spreads all the way to the back of the house, anything which under the ledge. So if you have kalim under the ledge in the back of the house, they will become impure. And it also will bring the tuma into the home. If there's tuma under the ledge, since it's eating into the doorway, it's a continuation of the oil into the home, and it'll spread the tuma into the home, and from the home also out onto the ledge to around the entire area of the ledge. But if it was only eating into the doorway, less than a tefach, either this interpretation, eating into the actual doorway, or this interpretation, above the doorway, but the point is it was less than a tefach. So now, what we're going to say is that the ledge is subservient to the home, but the home is not subservient to it. And therefore, the tuma babayis, if the source of impurity was inside the home, kelim shetachtav tmeim, it will spread to under the ledge, and any utensils under the entire ledge will become impure. Tuma tachtav, however, if the source of impurity is under the ledge, since it isn't eating a full tefach into the doorway, it's not, the home doesn't become subservient to it. It doesn't bring the impurity into the home. And the same principles apply. If you have a courtyard which is surrounded by a little achsadra, which is basically a roofed, slight roof around with poles to make the area a little bit more pleasant to sit in. So same thing, if it was eating into the doorway, if this roofed part was eating into the doorway, a tefach, which either again means over the doorway or in the doorway, then if it's a full tefach, then it and the home are considered to be one long extension, and the tumah will spread from it to the home, from the home to it, and all around it. If it's less than a tefach, then if the tumah is in the home, it will spread to everything under this roofed area, but if it is under the roofed area, it will not spread into the home. Halacha Gimel, ledges on windows. You have a window that's made for usage, which is the Rambam defined in chapter 14 and 15. This means it's a tefach by a tefach in space. That's how big it has to be when you want to use the window to put stuff on it, etc. And you have a ledge coming out from on top of the window. Here we have another special law. Even if it's only the thickness of a thumb breadth, since it's clearly an extension of the window, so it will spread the tuma into the home through it, even if it's the slightest width. But it has to be close enough to the window to be clear that it's associated with the window. It has to be within 2 finger breadths of space or less from the top of the window. If it was above 2 finger breadths, now it's its own functioning oil. It will not spread tuma under itself unless it has the width of a full tefach. What happens if the window was not made for use, it was made for light? Even smaller requirements. Chapter 14 and 15, even a third of a tefach by a third of a tefach is already a chaleinu asuya lemoyer. And now you have a ledge above that window. Here, it will spread tuma under it at even the slightest size, even less than a thumb breadth, no matter how high above the window it is. Now, let's consider how this interplays with a ledge under the window. You have a little structure that comes out in front of the window, onto which somebody who was looking out of the window would lean when he wants to look out of the window. So here, this is not part of the structure. It does not spread tuma under it, and certainly not into the home, because it's a separate unit. Of course, if it was a tefach by a tefach, then it would, but only to things that are under it. If there was, in addition to the ledge in front of the window, there was also a ziz on top of the window, so now you have both. A fascinating law emerges. We take a look at this lower thing, and we treat it as if it doesn't exist. Instead, we only pay attention to this one, and it does have the qualifications to spread the tuma. It will spread tuma into the home. Why do we not look at this structure? Why don't we say tefach by a tefach? It should block the tumah. So the commentaries have two approaches to this. Number one, these in front of the window ledges were not attached securely to the building. They were always meant to be taken off if you wanted to. So it's not as much part of the building as a ziz is. Therefore, this is the main one, this is not the main one. The other one says even if it is securely attached, it's not treated as part of the building because it's only there to service the person in the home so he can have a good time leaning. Whereas the awning on top of the window services the building directly. Continues the Rambam, the Ketzad Mevi and Kol Azizino Elu Tuma. All of these ledges that we're talking about, what does it mean that they spread Tuma under them? It means Sheim Hoisa Tuma Tachas Echad Man. If there was a source of impurity under one of them, Oy Babayis, or in the home to which they're attached, Hakol Tameh, everything is impure, Bein Babayis, Bein Tachas Aziz, whether what's in the home or what's under the ledge. And now we go to the case of double ledges. Halacha Dalet Shnei Zizin Zeh Al Gav Zeh. You have two ledges sticking out of a window, sticking out of a wall, whatever it is, one above the other. V'yesh b'chol echad mehen perseach tefach, u'beineim perseach tefach. We begin with the case where each one classifies as an oyhel. It's a tefach by a tefach wide, and there's a tefach of space in between them. So it's very reminiscent in yesterday's case of the two beams in the two floors of the home, one on top of the other. Says the Rambam, if the source of impurity under the lower ledge, tachta bilvad tamei, only what's under it becomes impure. It doesn't transfer the impurity through it because it's a tefach by a tefach. It blocks the tumah. Hoisa tumah beinein, if tumah was between them, a source of impurity was right here in between. Beinein bilvad tamei, only what's between them is going to be impure because the tumah will be blocked by the oil on top and the oil on bottom. Hoysal gav ha'elyoin, if the source of impurity was on top of the higher one, so it doesn't go downwards because it's blocked by an oil of a tefach by a tefach. However, kenegde adarakia tame, what's above it all the way to the sky will be impure. That's if the two ledges are equally one above the other and they're both a tefach. What if hoya ha'elyoin oidif ala tachton peseach tefach? The upper ledge protruded past the lower ledge by a tefach. Ignore this. Less than a tefach. No, it's a full tefach. Okay. The top ledge is a full oyhel, let's call it, extending past the lower oyhel. In this case, as we're going to see, it becomes one long oyhel. And therefore, says the Rambam, v'tuma tachas hatachten, oy beineyen, if the source of impurity was anywhere under the lower ledge, or between the ledges, or as the commentaries add, even if they were in this space, the space that's not under the lower ledge, but is above the upper ledge, Tachteyan ubeineyan tameh. This immediately transfers the tumah to all the area under both ledges and the area between the ledges. Because in other words, we imagine as though the upper extension comes down lower, becomes one oyel, and brings the tumah to everything under it. Hoysal gav ha'elyon. But if it was above the top ledge, so of course that's just a blocker. Kenegdir adarakia tameh. What's above it to the sky is impure, but downwards doesn't go downwards. What if the above ledge, as in this text over here, was only protruding less than a tefach above or past the lower ledge? So here we kind of go back to that subservient concept, that the extra area can become subservient to the area under the lower one, but not the lower one to the area, that extra area under the higher ledge. And therefore we have the law as follows: the tumah tachteyem, if the tumah was under them, tachteyem ubeineyen tameh. What's under them and what's between them is impure because the tumah spreads again from the extra part that's sticking out over here all the way to the whole area under the top ledge, and the tumah is in between them. From there it descends also to the area under them. But if the tumah was between them or under the area that's only under the top ledge, so indeed it goes upwards and to the area in between. Those become impure. But under the lower ledge it doesn't spread, because you can't call the whole lower ledge subservient to the area that's just under the higher ledge. Since it's less than a tefach, it isn't a full el on itself. Now, until now, we've been assuming that the space between the two ledges is a full tefach. Therefore, each ledge is considered to be an oil on its own. But what if yesh bechol echad me'an peseach tefach ve'ein beinein peseach tefach? Each individual ledge is a tefach by a tefach wide. However, the space between them is not a full tefach, which means, if you think about it, that the upper ledge cannot be considered to be an oil for anything inside here. Because to be considered an oil, besides for being a tefach by a tefach, you also have to have a height of an airspace of a tefach, which you don't have over here. So therefore, in a way, we're going to look at these two ledges as one thick ledge. And therefore, says the Rambam, the tumah tachas hatachten, if the tumah, the source of tumah, is found under the lower ledge, tachta bilvad tameh, only what's under it is impure, it doesn't penetrate this ledge, because it's a tefach by a tefach, and it blocks the tuma. But if the source of impurity is between them or on top of the top one, only upwards to the sky is impure. So if the tuma is in the middle one, that kind of makes sense. It won't go lower down, because this is a tefach by a tefach, which is on top of an airspace, so for sure a tefach. Good oil, it's a good blocker. It will go upwards through this ledge, because there isn't an airspace of a tefach, so that's called tumah ritzutza. By kas va'ila goes all the way through. But how come over here, when it's on the top ledge, I get that it goes up, why won't it go down? It should go down and penetrate this area, because this ledge is not really a real oil. So here, the commentaries say, because we treat both ledges like one thick piece, and it doesn't penetrate the ledge itself. So therefore, it won't penetrate the area between the two ledges. Ein bohen peseach tefach. If the ledges themselves aren't even a tefach by a tefach, bein sheyesh beineim peseach tefach or bein she'ein beineim peseach tefach. It doesn't matter what the conditions are, whether there is between them a tefach or not. Bein shayisa tuma tachas atachtene beineim nelagav ve'elyon, where the tuma is, under the lower one, in the middle, or on top of the top one. Since they're not a tefach by a tefach, they're non-existent. Tuma bekas va'ila bekas v'yeredas. The tuma will split upwards and split downwards only to the area directly above them and below them. Shaharei hidetzutza, because it's cramped. It's cramped tuma under oil, which is not a proper tefach. V'chein, and the same thing that we just said in all these cases for two ledges will also apply to shtei yiriyos shehin gvayis mina aretz peseach tefach, two curtains, two cloths that are a tefach above the ground. Zu al gabe zu, one is top of the other. So there's a tefach of space under the lower one, and I have two cloths. So all the same laws will apply. If they're both a tefach, if between them is a tefach, less than a tefach, wider than one wider than the other, all the laws that apply to ledges also apply to cloths. And the commentaries discuss what's the chiddush over here. Why is the Rambam saying it? It's a lengthy discussion, not for now. Another similar halacha with things piled on top of each other. Kelim ay begadim, you have multiple utensils, multiple clothes. Commentaries say even if it's one piece of clothing folded multiple times. Point is, there's a bunch of layers of clothing. Oy luches shal eight, so there's a bunch of boards. Shein munachin zeh al gabe zeh, one on top of the other. V'tumar ritzutza beinein, and there's a corpse flesh, a source of impurity, cramped between them. Somewhere between the boards there's a piece of corpse flesh. So we have to check where is the corpse flesh relative to the ground. Im hoisa tuma gvoya mina aretz tefach, if the source of impurity was a tefach above the ground, so we consider all the underboards as if they're non-existent. The top board, the board on top of the corpse flesh, that's the main one. We say that's an oihel, and it's covering a space of a full tefach. Yeah, that space happens to be filled up with other boards, but we could just ignore it for our halachic purposes. We could say that there's an oihel over a tefach of space in which there's a piece of corpse flesh. And therefore, it will spread the impurity across the whole area under that board. Whatever utensils are under that board become impure. However, if they were marble slats, even if they're 1,000 amma above the ground, plenty of space for a tefach oil. Tuma by kas va'ila by kas v'yeredas. We don't treat it as an oil covering a tefach of space. We treat it as a cramped tuma. Tuma goes simply upwards and downwards, doesn't spread anywhere. Because marble slats are treated like ground. Halacha hey. You have two wooden boards that are touching each other only at their corners. They're both suspended in the air. A tefach, which means they each on their own classify as an oil. And there's a piece of corpse under one of them. And there's utensils under a second one. The question is this touching point make them one big oil? And the answer is no. If there's a corpse here, any utensils under the second one are pure. Because they aren't touching at the point of a tefach wide. We had before, in a couple chapters ago, that if you have one long beam, even if the beam at different points becomes less than a tefach, then the tumah still spreads everywhere. But once you have a separate beam, tumah will not spread from one board to another board without a contact space of a tefach. However, if you touch the board, kelim under it are fine. But if you touch the board, which is touching the other board, which is covering the corpse, it's like touching utensils that are in the midst of touching a tent that's covering over a dead body, which is a higher level impurity. The Rambam uses the word shenagu, that touched in the past, but the commentators explain it as in the current. It's called Tuma b'chiburim, Tuma of connection. The board is literally touching the board while it's covering the corpse. So when you touch that, it's like touching any utensil, which is touching a tent that's making a covering over a corpse. Aval, however, and the commentaries discuss what's the however here, what's the contrast. I'll give you just one approach. The contrast is that Rambam is trying to teach us something. In these two boards, when you touch the second board, what did we just say? It's like touching a utensil that touched an oihel. We had a similar case a couple chapters ago, chapter 13, also chapter 12, that if you have a covering, some kalim over a utensil, over a mace, spread the tumah, but they don't block it. Everything above them also becomes impure. So the Rambam wants to differentiate in that case between two types of kalim. If you have utensils that are on top of that board, that are directly above the dead body, that's not called kelim shenagu b'oyel hameis. That's not utensils touching an oil. That's kelim that are themselves an oil. Only the utensils that are on the sides of the board, that are just being affected because the tumah spreads and it doesn't block, those are like this board over here, kelim shenagu b'oyel hameis. That's the Rambam's aval. Aval, however, so now let's see it inside. What's the comparison here? Or what's the contrast here? However, kol ha-kelim she'amarnu. All the utensils that we mentioned in chapters 12 and 13, which can spread tumah but not block it, if that utensil becomes a covering over a dead body, kol kelim sha'al gabav tmeim kamesha be'arnu. Any utensil that's directly above the corpse, on top of that utensil, becomes impure, as we explained. Bitum asan mishum kelim hama'ahilin alames. They become impure on account of a utensil that became a tent over a dead body. The af hakelim sha'al gabav she'enam keneged atuma, and even the other utensils on top of it that are not opposite the impurity, they're also tmeim, they're also impure. Like the case of the board, mishum kelim shenagu bekelim she'ahilu alames, because of utensils which touched a utensil that's making an oil over a dead body. Touch this board, it's a board touching a board that's making an oil over a dead body. That's the same idea. Halacha vav, we turn now to barrels. And the Rambam, when he talks about this halacha, he draws a picture in his commentary to the Mishnah of a barrel with straight walls. This is a picture of an ancient pottery barrel split in half. You can see the concept. It's pretty straight walls. The walls are pretty thick, as in the Rambam's picture, which will become relevant in a moment. Says the Rambam, Chavis shehi yesheves al shuleha ba'avir. You have a clay barrel sitting on its bottom in the open air. Ukizayis min Meis nasun b'seicha oy tachtea keneged avira. And there's a kazayas of corpse flesh that's inside of it, or under it, opposite the space, the open space. Not opposite the space of the walls, under it over here in this area, where if it would split through, it would come to open air. So, tuma beikas va'ela, beikas v'yeredes. So the tuma itself, of course, goes upwards and downwards. V'hechavis tmeya, and the barrel itself also becomes impure. Shari'at tuma beikas mitachteha v'nit misavira. Even though pottery utensils have to have tumah in their airspace. So granted, when the tumah is inside it, it makes it impure. What about if it's under it? But when it's under it, it splits through to the airspace. Now the airspace is impure, so the whole barrel becomes impure. Hoisa tumah tachas avi dafna. But if the impurity was under the thickness of its wall, tumah beikas va'ila beikas v'yeredes v'hechavis tohira. The tumah does split upwards and downwards. Anything above this space will become impure, but the walls itself of the barrel stay pure. Why is the barrel pure? Because the tumah is never splitting through its airspace, only through its wall. And a pottery utensil can never become impure unless tumah enters its airspace. Here it never did, so the barrel itself never becomes impure. What if it was part and part? Tumah sitting right over here. It's partially under the thickness of the wall, partially under the airspace. And as the commentaries say, the part that's under the airspace doesn't have a kazayas on its own. It isn't big enough on its own to transmit impurity. So, tuma beikas va'ila, beikas v'yeredes. First of all, the tuma goes up and down. The question is, does the barrel become impure? So the Rambam says, we have to look at the walls. Hoya badfanos peseach tefach. If the walls had a space of a tefach under them. Now how do you have walls with a space of a tefach under them if they're straight walls? Most of the commentaries explain this clause as referring to a wide barrel with like a stomach. So in the sides of the barrel, not even the part that's open to the air, the parts that are covered, you could have a space of a tefach. The Rambam says it's straight walls. So the commentaries explain that this is a case where the walls peter downwards. They are straight on the outside, but on the inside they peter downwards. So you can have a space right over here, a tefach by a tefach, that's not open to the open air directly. If you would climb upwards, you would reach the top of the barrel's walls. So the Rambam says in this case, when it's partially half-half over here, kula tmeya, the entirety of the area in the walls becomes impure. Ukeneged piyah tahir, but what's right above, open to the open air, will be pure. Shari'at tuma pashta badfanes bilvad, because the tuma can only spread to the area inside the walls. Remember, these barrels were, at the top they had a mouth, but then there was the walls. So only the part that can go straight down, opposite the mouth will stay pure. All the area inside that you see over here, the area around it, not under the circle of the mouth, will become impure. Medvarim says the Rambam, when do we say this whole halacha? B'chavis tahira. If to begin with, the barrel was pure, before this kazayas ended up under it, wherever it ended up. Avalim haisa tmeya. But if it was to begin with impure, so it's not going to be a good blocker, or it was a tefach raised above the ground, so it becomes an ayah. Or it was covered or turned on its mouth. Now it becomes like a grave, as the commentaries say. Like it becomes like literally an entity of impurity. Whether tuma was under it, in it, or on top of it, the entirety of the barrel is impure. Everything is impure. Anything touching it is impure. The whole thing, it's literally like a grave. A grave on all sides transmit impurity. So does this barrel. If the barrel was tightly sealed. We're going to explore this concept in chapter 20 and on. The idea that if you have what's called a tightly wrapped utensil, anything inside it is not considered to be in the same tent as a dead body. It's all saved. So the Rambam says, even if the barrel is sitting on top of a corpse, any food and drink in it are pure because of the rule of tzamid pasil. But any utensils above it are going to be impure because the tumah will split through them. Another law relating to barrels, and you have a bunch of barrels sitting on their bottom, or lying on their sides, in the open air. They're touching each other in a way that there's a tefach of space in those openings. So here, two barrels are touching, and right over here you have a tefach by a tefach space. Same thing over here. They're touching at the top. Under them there's a tefach of space. And there's tuma under one of them, literally under the barrel. So an interesting thing happens. Tuma baikas va'ila baikas v'yeredes mipnei shehida tzutza. We don't look at the space over here as being any sort of oil or any sort of spreader. The tuma, since right here where it is, it's cramped, it goes straight up and straight down, and that's it. Nothing else around it will become affected by the impurity. Even over here, it's a bigger chiddush. You have tuma right over here. It'll split through both sides of the barrel before going to the sides. However, same caveat, when do we say this? If they were pure. But if they were impure, or even if they were pure, but they were raised a tefach from the ground, now there's an oil under the entire area, if there's tuma under one of them, under the entirety of all the barrels becomes impure, because it's all one tent. So the second case, that's easy to understand. If they're all raised by a tefach, so that means that even the bottom of the barrel is covering a tefach by a tefach space. So, since they're touching, the tumah will spread to all the areas under the barrels. Same thing over here. If they're raised by a tefach, it will spread to everything. But if they're impure, the Rambam implies, even if they're less than a tefach from the ground, the tumah will still spread. Why is that? Here the commentaries explain, when you're dealing with an impure barrel, we do not treat it as though, let's look over here, it'll be easier to understand. When you have an impure barrel, we delete the whole bottom half. We don't call this ritzutza. We don't call it cramped. Cramped means you're cramped under a tahor covering. But if the thing itself is impure, so we delete this half, we make it as if only the top half of the barrel is covering the corpse. That's a tefach of space, and therefore it will spread to under all the barrels. Same thing over here, we're talking about obviously barrels that have a tefach of an oil or they're covered. The point is we delete the bottom half, and we treat it as if they're under the top halves of the barrels, which are good oils, and therefore they spread when they're tameh to all the other barrels, being as it's one big oil, spreading tumah to everything under it.